and ended up as an advisor on foreign policy to the Prime Minister. Actually, several Conservative Prime Ministers. There was a lot of movement in that role. John, you will know, is Professor of History and Foreign Policy at King's London. He's a Fellow of Policy Exchange. Once again, I re-emphasise the centrality of Policy Exchange in this project. Also a Fellow at Stanford. No longer a contributing writer to the New Statesman, but I hope you'll continue to write for the magazine, even though I have departed as editor. You wrote an acclaimed biography of Clement Attlee, which I greatly admired, although the only hostile review of that book was published in the New Statesman. Not by me, by the late David Marquand, which shows the independence of that good title. John, you're going to talk about the foreign policy of the great Attlee government from 45 to 51, with particular focus on Ernest Bevin. So I'm fascinated to hear what you're going to have to say. John's going to speak for about 30 minutes, after which I'll lob up a couple of soft volleys for him to put away. And then I'll open up to some questions. There's a lot of you here, so no doubt we will have some good questions. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Jason. First of all, thank you to Jason for that very kind introduction and many years of generous editorial work. You did give me that bad review in the New Statesman, but you also subsequently wrote a very nice one for me in the Sunday Times. So we were covered in that sense. I should mention that. I'm very grateful to Lord Godson and Julia Mitson and Policy Exchange for hosting this event, and thanks in particular to Jonathan Rutherford, who is heading up the Future of the Left project here, and Marcus Hillarts Hendricks and others who have done the work behind the scenes for today. PX is currently straddling a huge range of left, right, political economy and national security issues. So it's a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm surprised and happy to see such a big turnout as well, including some scoundrels and former friends I recognise in the audience. Today's talk is scheduled to be just over 30 minutes, so we can leave some time for discussion, both on Bevin himself and today's foreign policy challenges. Now, the great Bevin biographer Alan Bullock took over 1,000 pages and 3 volumes to give his verdict on Bevin. So I'm going to preface my remarks with an important caveat. Please do not expect a belt and braces, cradle-to-grave account of the life and times of Ernie Bevin from 1881 to 1951, or a definitive judgment on every thorny debate he was involved in, from the general strike to the question of Palestine. For those interested in that longer term or more detailed debate, I know that Professor Anne Dayton at Oxford University is currently working on Bevin. There is Andrew Adonis's very good recent biography, which I revisited in the last few days. And there are esteemed Bevin experts here, like my friend Jill Bennett, the former chief historian at the Foreign Office. Let me also flag the work of 2 of my former graduate students, who are both dealing with policy issues at the moment, who helped formulate my own thoughts on this subject. Nick Catterby, who wrote an excellent PhD on the British left and questions of international order before 1945, and that included Bevin, Beveridge, Keynes and Hugh Dalton, and also Andrew Earhart, whose work on Foreign Office post-war planning is due out later this year and really captures a kind of golden age of deep strategic thinking in King Charles Street, which I believe remains a model for us today. I do hope to do some limited historical service in capturing the heroic, if flawed, elements of the Bevin story, what you might call the essence or the ethos of his foreign policy, but I won't use my time to recount the better known elements of that story, such as the formation of NATO or the Berlin airlift, because I want to leave some room to address current events. And in fact, to turn back to Jason, the inspiration behind today's lecture is an essay I wrote in the New Statesman before Christmas in Jason's valedictory issue as editor, called The Rise of Machine Politic. The theme of that essay was that we were in a moment in which raw power, economic power, military power, technological power, productive and purchasing power, by the way, it's important for a Northern Irishman to say power as many times as possible for your entertainment, was being exerted in international affairs with a force and an unapologetic brusqueness in a way we'd not seen in generations, perhaps at any point since this side of 1945. And this, I argued, was particularly hard for those with progressive sensibilities to adjust to. It was, and indeed is, a jarring challenge to a deeply held worldview that stresses the primacy of international law and the need for historical humility on our part as the organising principles of our foreign policy. And I engaged, you should recognise the argument by now, I engaged in some gentle back and forth with Professor Philippe Sands on this point, who has very respectfully offered an alternative reading of the international system in a subsequent essay in The Spectator. Despite the scale of the challenge, however, I also argued in the New Statesman piece against a counsel of despair and what I call a possum-like approach to the world around us. That is the habit of pretending to be dead when a predator approaches in order that you are not eaten alive. In my view, fortune will favour the brave in this new era, so we need therefore a Bevinite doggedness and ingenuity, and above all a sense of purpose in our foreign policy, rather than succumbing to Spenglerian angst. Usefully, there are ample examples of similar moments in history in which progressive sensibilities were shocked into a forcible reappraisal by the bracing winds of world affairs. And there are striking examples of how figures on the left, including those at the centre of the Labour Party's history, adapted to these challenges and changes with tough-mindedness, strategic thinking, and skillful statecraft. Attlee, of whom I wrote a biography before I went into number 10, and Bevin, his foreign secretary from 45 to 51, are two of those figures. And indeed, Attlee has already been cited by the current Prime Minister as an inspiration behind the government's foreign policy. And he did so at his first NATO summit, which took place a few days after the general election, and which I attended as an advisor. As the Prime Minister told NATO allies, quote, "We must mobilise what Bevin called our collective moral and material force," a phrase that I will come back to because I think it is an important one. I can't think how that found its way into his speech. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy has made Bevin one of the heroes of his concept of progressive realism, along with Robin Cook, Blair's first Foreign Secretary, who's taken to represent the more progressive side of that progressive realist equation. This concept is explained in a Foreign Affairs essay that appeared last year, in which the Foreign Secretary, then Shadow Foreign Secretary, praised Bevin for being, quote, "committed to realism, a politics based on respect for facts." The examples used to illustrate this point included his role in the acquisition of the nuclear deterrent, the stiffening of the US position on the blockade of Berlin, and the formation of NATO. Less good was the fact that Bevin, in the Foreign Secretary's words, too breezily justified the wrongs of colonialism through claims that such measures were taken in the national interest. It is a theme, the Bevin theme, to which the Foreign Secretary returned in his Locarno speech last month, when he praised Bevin for being able to see through the geopolitical fog that clouded the horizon after 1945. Consonant with the Prime Minister's evocation of Bevinite notions of moral and material force, Bevin was praised, and I quote again, as a minister of action who did not wait long for the fog to clear before designing and executing a strategy to, quote, preserve peace by mobilizing force. Again, I think this is the right framing and the right language: action, mobilization, spiritual and material force. So as a biographer of Attlee, but also another great Foreign Secretary, Conservative Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh, I welcome this invocation of the past, and I think it provides a timely opportunity to do some further excavation work of the historical record. To frame my remarks, I think it worth drawing out three characteristics in the political life of Bevin which strike me as particularly resonant today, though not necessarily replicable, and I'll come back to that at the end. First of all, Bevin's style, by which I mean his disposition, core assumptions, and approach to political struggle. Bevin's formation took place in the trade union movement. He was the General Secretary of the biggest amalgamated trade union in the most industrialised country in the world for over 2 decades, 1922 to 1945. He was parachuted into a parliamentary seat in 1940 to serve in the cabinet, but he was not by training or by inclination a parliamentarian. So the Bevin of the dock strikes, industrial disputes and labour negotiations was the same Bevin who took Eden's seat at Potsdam in 1945 and faced down Stalin, telling him via a bemused translator that in Britain we call a spade a spade. His style was abrasive and flecked with some unpleasant prejudices against Jews and Catholics, for example, but his background made Bevin a unique and effective political force, who took on communism, fascism, pacifism, and bourgeois liberal intellectualism in a direct and uncompromising manner. He also, importantly, blew away the cobwebs in the Foreign Office and empowered its better and more dynamic side, creating an organisation, and I choose my words carefully, that thought more deeply and did more stuff. Second, questions of substance, by which I mean some of the key interventions and decision points on which Bevin exerted his full political weight before 1945 and afterwards, including the few times when there was a difference between him and Attlee. Yes, there was a hard and unsentimental realism at his core, but there was also far more idealism than is sometimes understood. At peak moments of enthusiasm, Bevin went so far as entertaining more utopian goals of achieving a new world order of federated states, or at least a united Europe, though he stepped back from each when the crucial moment came. But Bevin's ethic of statecraft was also consciously differentiated from what he saw as the self-conscious moralism of others on the left. Looking at the key foreign policy debates of this era, one can see this tussle playing out time and time again between a legalistic form of progressive politics based on the conscience, personal ethics and rights of the individual, and a Bevin, Attlee, Dalton alternative that emphasised a duty to the societal collective, including, particularly at times of international competition, an unapologetic defence of the interests of the nation state. Third, questions of strategy. Following on from substance and style, I want to get to a broader point about grand strategy in the era of Bevin. To be clear, I do not think the circumstances that enabled Britain to pursue grand strategy as it did in the Attlee-Bevin era are easily replicable today. They came about from a unique convergence of Keynesianism, the Beveridge Report, coalition government, full employment and mobilisation for full-scale industrial great power war. But I do think the strategic characteristics of Bevin's approach are worthy of further distillation, and that perhaps we could learn something of an all-of-government strategy or approach to strategy, a point to which I will return as I close the lecture. But first, let me turn to questions of style and substance. To set the scene, Ernest Bevin was born into poverty in 1881 in rural Somerset, just 16 years after the death of the great Victorian Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. He never knew his father and his mother. A servant girl died when he was 8 years old, so he went to live with his sister's half family. He had little formal education, but taught himself to read, often reading the newspaper for his family or later for his union colleagues. He began work at the age of 11 as a labourer and then a lorry driver in the Bristol docks. In his obituary, the Times described him as a working class John Bew, which was partly about his manner and partly due to his thick-set frame. Bevin was for a time a lay preacher, yet his skill at corralling and mobilising was steered towards a lifelong commitment to trade unionism. He was an advocate of the so-called new unionism, which was an effort to break down the differences between the different trades and skilled and unskilled labour. And this was the inspiration behind the Transport and General Workers Union, which he established by amalgamating 30 different unions into one. Bevin believed that, and I quote, the salvation of the working man was to be achieved not through political revolution, but through industrial organisation. And Attlee summed up his philosophy very neatly later. He never forgot that politics, whether domestic or international, are concerned with the lives of ordinary men and women. Bevin's lifelong distaste for communism derived from his trade union background. It was the ideology, but also the hyper-factionalism and harsh Leninist realpolitik that he thought so damaging to his efforts to build up working-class solidarity. He was a ferocious opponent, therefore, of any idea of a unity front between Labour and the far left, even after MacDonald's betrayal and the formation of the national government left Labour effectively decimated at the start of the 1930s. Bevin is quoted, perhaps apocryphally, as responding to a question from King George on how he had acquired such a wide knowledge of public affairs by saying, "Sir, it was gathered in the hedgerows of experience." It was the dock strikes of 1911 and the concomitant role of industry and shipping in great power competition which gave him a sense of the increasing interconnectedness of the domestic and the foreign. His introduction to American trade unionism on a visit in 1915 was also a formative experience in broadening his perspective, and he became a lifelong champion of the International Labour Organization, and in fact his goal was to be the Secretary General of the ILO. For Bevin, global disorder was driven by the distortions of modern capitalism. So any viable international order would have to end the scramble for raw materials by a rational and equitable sharing of resource, supply and distribution between primarily the great powers and latterly their empires. He became to believe that the international legal structures of the League of Nations were too detached from the productive forces that underlay national power and the interwar battle to enhance national power. In contrast to what he saw as traditional diplomacy, he saw the economic and industrial dimensions of statecraft as increasingly important to foreign policy. One might call this approach collectivist in its ethos. Everyone in and around the labour movement in the interwar years shared a desire to make good on the promises of the League of Nations. But there was a tension at critical moments between those who emphasised primary responsibility to the societal collective first, i.e. the nation state, and those for whom ideas of universal or inalienable rights should be at the core of progressive politics. An early example is Attlee's falling out with his brother over the latter's pacifism during the First World War, which Attlee regarded as a form of anarchic individualism. Patriotism was the glue which held society together. Rights were not natural or inalienable. They were dependent on the faithful rendering of duties to the collective through, for example, volunteering in the First and Second World Wars. But it was Bevin, more than anyone else, who became the symbol of Labour's toughening attitude to the world crisis over the course of the 1930s, taking on pacifism, opposing the idea of a popular front, and arguing that threats from fascism and communism made rearmament and mobilisation an imperative. By the autumn of 1933, Bevin and Attlee began to join forces to attack the pacifism of the Labour leader George Lansbury and figures like Stafford Cripps, who had gone so far as to table a motion in the Labour Party conference in favour of a general strike if the government attempted to mobilise the country for war. This rumbling dispute was brought to a head by Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in October 1935, which presented the greatest challenge to the international order since the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The news of the invasion reached England on the eve of the Labour Party conference, and in a famous scene, Bevin rose in front of the hall and accused Lansbury of hawking his conscience around from body to body as the world around him caught fire. For Bevin, Lansbury's mistake was to put his faith in a rickety international architecture, set up with great intentions after 1918, which was crumbling all around them. Instead, the best way to defend civilization was not to seek solace in a personal ethical coda or cling to high legalism. It was to mobilize resource in the search for collective security. The first step, therefore, was to support the government on rearming for war, and in fact to encourage the government to rearm for war, embracing the demands it would place on industry and the unions. Crucially, as the League of Nations fell apart, Bevin did not give up on the project of building a new international order. The work was more important than ever. In 1939, he joined a working group at Chatham House on world order and read H.G. Wells's 1940 book of the same name. There were immense problems with Western capitalism, but like Orwell, Wells and the patriotic left, he was convinced of the superior merits of Western civilization against those who were trying to snuff it out. The immediate task was to pay for the war in a way that left some hope for reconstruction. And in November 1939, John Maynard Keynes published 2 letters in the Times called Paying for the War, which he sent directly to Attlee and Bevin. He argued for a bulk percentage of all incomes to be paid directly to the government, partly to serve the war machine and partly as compulsory savings to prepare for its aftermath, when high levels of inflation would hit. Interestingly, the plan was greeted with some dismay in Labour circles as a potential assault on working class living standards and an albatross around their neck electorally. Attlee made the point that the working classes had often sought a safety net through insurance schemes, holding their own property, as well as co-op shares, post office savings and bank deposits. Giving this up for a promised New Jerusalem or future new social contract would be seen as risky. Ultimately, Keynesian economics was to become the foundation stone of the Labour government of 45 to 51, but the marriage is not as straightforward as one would have presumed. On the 14th of May 1940, as the public learned that Labour would come into government under Churchill, the cartoonist David Lowe captured the event with a famous cartoon called All Behind You, Winston, and it captured Churchill marching into battle with his sleeves rolled up. Alongside him were the leading figures in the Labour Party. First by Churchill's side was Attlee. Next, Bevin, who was to be the new Minister of Labour and National Service. And the third was Herbert Morrison, the leader of London County Council, who became the Minister of Supply, as well as Peter Mandelson's grandfather. This trio made up Labour's big three in the government. Their responsibility was for the home front, mobilisation of manpower and industry, and preparations for national defence. And they were joined by Hugh Dalton, who was to become Chancellor, and who was then appointed Minister for Economic Warfare, and who was given a special brief for special operations and subversion in Germany, after Dalton expressed the really interesting view, in my opinion, that such work, subterfuge, appealing to German workers to undermine the Nazi regime, quote, needed to be done from the left. On entering the Ministry of Labour in 1940, Bevin drafted a memo on the diplomatic service to the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. In it, he complained about the neglect of social questions in British foreign policy. Diplomatic cables too often ignored, quote, what the working people are thinking and feeling in various countries. Only extreme movements, he complained, become of interest because they menace the existing order of society. A few months later, Bevin gave a speech to the Lancashire unions identifying the opportunity for social reconstruction that was emerging. Cooperation between government, employers and workers, and an open debate about how best to organise industry for the short term and the long term was, in his view, the antithesis of the totalitarian state. So the collective spirit inserted into government was the antithesis of the totalitarian state. Domestic and international reconstruction were two sides of the same coin, as captured in Labour's dramatic contribution to Article 5 of the Atlantic Charter in 1941. Late at night, as cables came in from Newfoundland, Attlee and Bevin inserted their own edits, calling a swift cabinet meeting, knowing that some of their Conservative colleagues were not there, calling for the fullest collaboration on, quote, improving labour standards, abolishing unemployment and want, and securing economic advancement and social security for all people. This was accepted by the American negotiating team, with one revision, the removal of abolishing unemployment, because it chimed closely with Roosevelt's concept of the New Deal. But there were tensions with other forces in the Labour Party who grew impatient at the deferral of an election and the continuation of the coalition, even after it was clear that the war would be won. In foreign policy terms, the first test was the fate of post-war Greece. As members of the War Cabinet, Attlee and Bevin had been anxious not to allow Greece to fall to communism to the extent that they were willing to prop up a military junta. If Labour was to win office, Bevin warned the Labour Party conference in late 1940, it could not carry out a policy on the basis of emotionalism. Foreign policy could not be reduced to matters of black and white or right and wrong. When he became Foreign Secretary in 1945, against expectations, the Daily Herald presented Bevin as the ideal heir to Churchillian robustness in diplomacy. Within days of the election, he and Attlee returned to Potsdam, as I've described, and on arrival, Bevin declared, as his first comment when he landed, when he stepped out off the plane, I'm not going to let Britain be barged about. To the discomfort of the American Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, he took the fight to Stalin, even though a lot of the post-war settlement had already been agreed before the UK general election. One of the early features of the Cold War was that Bevin's robustness against Stalinism outstripped that of his first American counterpart. Now, given the time remaining, it's not possible to go into any great depth into all the challenges he faced as Foreign Secretary. But it is worth pausing for a moment on the critical year of 1947 to demonstrate the extent to which almost every issue, the US post-war loan, nuclear sharing, Indian independence, the mandate in Palestine, the future of Greece, the Marshall Plan, and the Truman Doctrine was all interconnected. And in this context, Bevin's advocacy for an independent nuclear deterrent, which Attlee shared, but the Treasury strongly opposed, plus change, was partly about achieving a level of dependence from the United States, given Britain's debtor status and near bankruptcy. As he said, following his latest argument with Burns, I don't want any other foreign secretary of this country to be talked to or at by a Secretary of State in the United States, as I have just had in my discussion with Mr. Burns. We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it takes, he said of the bomb. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it. In January 1947, then, he and Attlee engineered a secret cabinet subcommittee to push their plan through. But then followed the biggest dispute between the Prime Minister and his Foreign Secretary in their time in government. Attlee believed that the costs of the bomb could partly be justified and covered by the fact that it would allow quicker demobilisation, including a huge drawdown of British troops from the Middle East. But Bevin and his military chiefs faced down a proposal to draw down 200,000 troops in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, including 80,000 troops who were in the Suez Canal. By this time, Bevin had decisively given up on the idea that Britain would become a third force in world affairs, using the Commonwealth and perhaps even the vestiges of the French Empire as a balancer between the Soviet Union and the United States. Alignment with Washington, D.C. was to be the key to British strategic solvency. However, this bet on America required Britain continuing to demonstrate its independence and its strength wherever it could. So a full-scale withdrawal from the Suez Canal and other areas would cause the US to write us off, Bevin warned. Meanwhile, he was able to point to other successes in January 47, which gave the Prime Minister confidence in his Foreign Secretary's overall strategy. Above all, he was making progress in his attempts to persuade the Americans to help to shoulder the burden in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly Greece and Turkey, where thousands of British troops were garrisoned and which were coming under increasing Soviet pressure. Significantly and transformatively, Bevin found a willing partner in George Marshall, the US Secretary of State, who in January 1947 replaced Burns. In a June 1947 speech at Harvard University, Marshall spoke of an urgent need to assist Europe in its economic recovery. Bevin, seizing the opportunity, became the champion of what became known as the Marshall Plan. As Attlee later commented, "I don't believe that Marshall, when he made his speech, had any idea it would be taken up by Bevin as he took it up." The day after the speech, Bevin assembled his advisors in the Foreign Office to shift British grand strategy up a few gears. British leadership in Western Europe would provide a funnel through which American military and economic power could be used to balance against the Soviets. Bevin began to advocate, therefore, for what he called a Western Union, a sort of spiritual federation of the West, primarily in Western Europe. The building blocks were put in place with the Treaty of Dunkirk in March 47 between Britain and France, the Treaty of Brussels in March 1948, and eventually the North Atlantic Treaty in April 1949. As I said at the outset, there were major areas where Bevin's record is far more dubious, such as the events leading up to the end of the British mandate in Palestine in May 1948. British policy was thrown sideways by Truman, but it failed on many accounts independently. One was a failure to absorb the geopolitical gravity and impact of the Holocaust. The second was the way in which the government scuttled and shuttled its responsibilities over to the United Nations. Ultimately, there were many competing strains on foreign policy, from the potential damage to the US relationship at the most critical moment to the fear of providing an opportunity for the Soviet Union to expand, but they lost strategic control as well as moral authority over this subject. On the handling of Indian independence, there is too much to be said to even attempt a judgment here. Given the social and national forces at hand, the room for manoeuvre was even more reduced. Partition was a hurried, chaotic, and deeply problematic process. The death toll and levels of violence that followed far outstripped those which followed in the Middle East. But looking at the parliamentary debates, memoirs, and views of their contemporaries, it is striking that, on the decision-making process and the question of moral authority, Bevin and Attlee were deemed to have come out better than they did over Israel-Palestine. Questions of strategy then. Time is tight, so let me finish with an attempt to distill the grand strategic lessons of Bevin's overall approach. First of all, it was a foreign policy that had at its centre of gravity the pursuit of the security, economic and social interests of the British people. Notions of international law and human rights were deemed important and desirable, but the first order of business was the remaking of the wartime and post-war social contract in Britain itself. The period of economic strife after 1918 and the failure to deliver on promises made to those who had fought in the war was the defining experience of Attlee and Bevin's generation. And the ultimate success of government in all areas of policy would be judged against what people had in their pocket over their heads or on their dinner table. Second, it was a foreign policy that began by identifying and then designing plans to counter the driving forces of anarchy and disorder. Some of these driving forces were structural, and in Bevin's mind represented the nadir of the capitalist system that he had been born into in late Victorian Britain. He saw international competition as fueled by monopolies, the hoarding of resource, and the forcible acquisition of territory to feed these needs. Properly functioning international institutions were needed to arbitrate this. But some of the drivers of anarchy and disorder were political, national, ideological, and in the Soviet Union's case, imperial. The way that other nations acted or behaved for self-interested or ideological reasons. So there was to be no apologia for communism, and he held an immense impatience for those who dilly-dallied over rearmament, who had a purist view that salvation would come through international law. Third, it was a foreign policy with strategic vision and purpose. Bevin was no simple materialist. He was a former lay preacher who evoked the spiritual dimension of foreign policy. He looked upwards. He built things designed to last. At the peak of his enthusiasm, he would conjure up images of world federation in which resources would be shared equitably across the globe. But equally, he recognized that the new international order could not be achieved by the force of reason alone. To be sustainable, it would need a balance of power and the collective summoning of productive forces to provide the necessary foundations onto which the legal superstructure could be built. And though it was not his ideal, the nation state remained the organising entity around which a foreign policy had to be constructed. Finally then, this combination of substance, style and strategy gave Bevin's foreign policy a unique dynamism and energy by which Britain, much weakened, clinging on to its position in 1945, could shape events rather than being shaped by them. This I would characterise as an activist, creative, imaginative posture in foreign policy to do things, build things, move first, take risks, deter things before they get worse, demonstrate your power to friends as well as foes, and to take a stand when needed. Some of this Bevin gleaned through a lifetime at the coalface of industrialism or through the experience of the mobilisation of manpower. As Foreign Secretary, it manifested itself as an ability to summon and channel all the elements of national power, from productive force to science or diplomatic ingenuity, and indeed to the nuclear bomb, in the pursuit of national or allied goals. Today, we sometimes paint a picture of the world order built out of the Second World War as some sort of high ground reached in the arc towards natural justice from which we dare not fall. But this would be to miss the major lesson of the construction of that order in the first place, that it required blood, sweat, tears, imagination, personality, decisiveness, productive power, hard power, and as I put it in my opening remarks, the mobilisation of material and spiritual force. Thank you.
That was wonderful, John. Is that the outline for your next biography, do you think?
I did think about doing Bevin a few years ago, but I think that's on the back burner. I've got another book to write.
Are you going to share what that is with us?
It's a book about the international order.
Okay. As we're on the international order, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction to Bevin. For those of you who are familiar with his positions, where I want to look at, I think, particularly with Trump in the White House, and here's a figure who you could say has a dynamic, creative, risk-taking, rule-breaking approach to foreign policy. Look at his announcements recently on Gaza, look at his announcement on tariffs and so on. But what was Bevin's relationship like with the United States? You mentioned this phrase, the third force. He saw at the end of the war potential for Britain somehow to position itself between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ultimately, he fell in behind the United States. But talk a little bit about his relationship with the United States, how it evolved, and what it might mean today. What can we learn from what Bevin and Attlee did, and what Lammy, Starmer, Rachel Reeves, and others might do today? First of all, in relation to America, foreign policy, but also the productive power of the economy today.
Okay. So first of all, as I said a little bit in the lecture, personality mattered and matters, I think, today. Yep. I think we're in an age in which it's not only an age of raw power and productive power, it's an age of quite distinctive and important personalities. So the politics of the the Elizabethan court or otherwise are back in play, and that's significant. Look at Bevin's relationship with Burns versus relationship with Marshall.
The latter being much better.
Much better. The second thing is that this is a really difficult period in Anglo-American relations. So the outcome of 45 to 49 is that Britain makes a pretty firm strategic choice, as I say, to align behind the United States to maintain its strategic solvency. But in each step along the way, there's huge difficulties in Anglo-American relations, structural and otherwise. There's three great crises, if you like. The first is the termination of Lend-Lease and then the difficult negotiations over a subsequent loan. The second is Truman's unilateralism with regard to the rights of Jews to emigrate to Israel that spooks the British government and leads to a remarkable letter from Attlee to his counterpart. And then the third is sharing of nuclear secrets, which of course is a joint wartime project, but for congressional and other reasons the US steps away from. Three major crises that go right to the core of the government's ability to function domestically as well. So it's a remarkably difficult period of time. But the other thing happening simultaneously, of course, is Soviet aggression in the midst of this again, which Bevin is so unsentimental and clear-eyed about, much more so than Attlee over this period of time. So you take those countervailing forces. Ultimately, as I say, the approach is not simply to base this around personality. It's to move towards a US-led proposition, but to do so in a hyper-activist way. So what Bevin does, and this is what leads to the formation of NATO, is to get ahead, for example, this notion of a Western European Union, a defensive alliance, inserting the notion of collective security. And I think that's the big strategic post-war achievement. The order built after 1918 has the international architecture and the principles and the principle of arbitration, but it's detached from power. The international order built after 1945 has that, but it has inserted into it both a more stable balance of power, and secondly, crucially, the concept of collective security, the willingness to act collectively in response to any threats to that power. Those are the building blocks, I think, that create this sort of different international order. All these things are live and important again. Yes. Both from the rules and the norms to also the questions of a collective security, who delivers it, what the burden share is, etc. And of course, in that era, like the era latterly, there's always an ambiguity with America's role in the world. It's there, present. People forget FDR is the great hero of this order. In the early 1930s, he's letting Europe default on its war debt, refusing to bail it out. He's a massive exponent of tariffs. So this push and pull, I think the historian will tell you, while the current era is remarkable and challenging in some respects, there are elements of it that we have seen beforehand.
Yeah, but significantly different, of course, is the absence of empire. We were beginning the retreat. You mentioned independence for India, Mandate Palestine, and so on. But a greater unravelling took place in the 50s and 60s and so on. So Britain today is much weaker. It's outside of the European Union. How should the UK position itself in relation to the United States and in relation to the Europeans?
So the big fundamental difference is empire, right, and the different views around it. And it's a mistake to presume that there was a kind of an imperial position and an anti-imperial position. That's a kind of product of sort of a modern day lens looking at this question. For Attlee and Bevin, the goal is to turn the empire into a commonwealth. And that includes the sharing of resources, but also concept, quite late Victorian imperial concepts of trusteeship, for example, as well. But Attlee, Bevin at certain critical moments accuses the Soviet Union of, quote unquote, coming across the neck of the British Empire by its activities in the Middle East. So there's a hard geopolitical game going on there as well. But the difficulty in the US relationship and its ambiguity, and also the uncertainty over the UK's role in the European project, which is emerging in this period of time as well, will be completely familiar to the Labour government from 45 to 51. There is a choice made not to enter more deeply into an economic union with the European Union. Why? Because a left-wing Labour government, one with the control of planning and the economy and manpower and full employment, wants to restructure the economy in a bespoke British fashion and doesn't want to enter a European Economic Union. And Attlee and Bevin are pretty clear on this as well. So they exist. And just to say that, I mean, there's the sense of weakness, I think, is underappreciated in 45. Britain is clinging to its position in the big three by the skin of its teeth. It is bankrupt at home, there is fear about communism, the red threat, and a Labour government as well. All this is going in the back. So don't underestimate the sense of fragility, I think, in 45 through to 47, really up to 48, 49.
And the fragility of the individuals in the famous Attlee cabinet. They were old men, they were unwell, a lot of them. Some of them were soon to die. I mean, it's an extraordinary period. We can go back to Bevin and American 45 with the audience. Progressive realism. When I went to Washington with David Lammy last spring, and he was reaching out to Republicans in particular, he had a lot of bilateral meetings with J.D. Vance and others because he was preparing the ground for a Trump victory. What about progressive realism? The Republicans said to me when I was in Washington with Lammy, we like the realism, but not this progressive bit. What is this progressive bit? What is it? And what do you think of the concept? You and I spoke about it before I went.
So there's others in this room are better placed to answer that. First of all,
you're well placed to
I
answer
think these concepts are actually.
You're well placed to answer.
I'll give it a go.
Give it a go.
These the foreign affairs essay that I mentioned that David Lammy produced. I think these exercises are quite important as signalling exercises. The US does them. And has done them since 1945, right? Which is what is my posture approach to the world, and it's a part of democratic debate, strategic debate, and continuity. It's a bloody hard thing to do, by the way, because really what you're doing by the time you produce them is trying to tick a lot of boxes and please a lot of stakeholders along the way. So it's quite hard to sort of say fully what you really think. Secondly, in the US, progressivism, I think, means something different than it does in the UK context, which is quite important. So I don't know if the translation works very well. I think the first user of progressive realism was Joseph Nye, who gives us all these concepts: soft power, smart power. He's also given us progressive realism. But if the proposition is that I'd say the version I like of it is this. So for Bevin, progress wouldn't have been a late 20th, early 21st century sense of progressivism. Progress would be that the allied Western civilized nations have a better handle on modernization, the changing and the future nature of political economy, science, technology, productiveness, mobilization. That is progress, progressivism, right? It's a sense and a grasp of modernity. So I think that quite appeals. But that's the thing that's really hard to do. So I mentioned in my lecture, the context is not there. So really my plea for anything else is to have a whole of government national strategy, and I can see some former ministers of them. That's extremely hard. That's an extremely hard thing to do. The context was there for them to do this. Bevin had seen the mechanics in here, the sort of engine in the coalface, and he had a sense of how that was fired up, and therefore he could sit at the table, deploy it when he possibly could. It's very hard. Diplomacy's sort of been detached again, and operates in a different sphere, and I think that's a problem, that's a challenge, but that's a strategic challenge for the UK and many other countries.
We're here at the inaugural event of the Future of the Left. Here at Politics Exchange, there's been a lot of comment about it. Some very interesting articles in the Times and elsewhere. Jonathan Rutherford and his team have reached out to number 10 Downing Street. There's been conversations with Morgan McSweeney and others. Something is going on. There's a change in the political weather. There's a redefinition, a reconfiguration of what left politics might mean in this age of raw power that you're talking about. What do you think this reconfiguration might be? Are we seeing a return to Bevin and Attlee? Or is it something new?
So I think we're at the foothills of this debate.
Foothills.
That's a good
metaphor, though.
But here's an important similarity. So what's happening in the middle part of the 20th century is the social contract is being rewritten, partly by the force of war and international events, partly by the mimicking and adoption of elements of the New Deal and the way the US is operating, partly in response to 5-year plans, Soviet Nazi mobilization, use of industry, use of science and technology, the race to radar, for example, to protect Britain, the race to nuclear sharing. So there's a really, if I was to write a simple book on a simple year, it would be 1940, and also 1941. You know, the British Association has this meeting which Einstein comes to on science and world order, right? So how do you harness what Churchill called, in the Nazi case, the perverted lights of science, to something more productive? This is the race to modernity, right? So it's a kind of a crucible of new ideas about science, innovation, war, whole new constructed alliance systems, new balances, right? A remarkably active period. I think we are approaching that as well.
Yes.
So if I'm reading some of these books by these new sort of tech founder doyens, who have in their hands in the United States a lot of that productive power. And by the way, AI requires a lot of energy and et cetera, et cetera. It's not just and vast sites where that energy is housed. So that is what there's a new there's a new industrialism, which doesn't look like the old grey metal version of it, and there's a new conversation on this political economy. But unless you have the answers to these questions, so how do you and the raw obvious political, which have always been the answers, are what it means is how do you ensure growth, right? So what's your approach to regulation? What's your approach to fostering these industries? How much sovereign capability can you have, or how much access? What regulatory orbit do you want to sit in? And the second question is how do you achieve security? Yes. And prosperity and security are kind of the basis of any government's agenda.
I think you're about to talk about securonomics. Whatever happened to that? We're going to take some questions because otherwise you and I just revisiting some of our old conversations from the past, which are wonderful. The lady there in the second row, and then the gentleman with the tie behind her, and then the lady in the third row there. So we'll take 3 questions and then we'll move through them as quickly as possible until Dean Godson emerges like the shopkeeper in Mr. Ben to call time. So first question, please.
Thank you. Hi there, Olivia O'Sullivan from Chatham House. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really interesting. I had a question which I think touches on your previous comment. You mentioned Bevin arguing against putting one's faith in rickety international institutions and for mobilising collective productive capacity, particularly for conflict. And that I think resonates today. I wonder how you apply the argument for mobilising collective capacity in a country with a very different economy from the one he faced, right? From one which is services dominated, which is globalised, in contrast to one which was massively industrialised. I'm just curious how you bring the UK's economy now into this picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman with his hand up.
Josh Arnold Forster. Thank you for the lecture, excellent lecture. Struck by your references to Bevin's relationship with the Treasury over nuclear weapons, but more generally, could you expand on that? How did he persuade the Treasury at that point to spend the kind of money, not just on nuclear weapons, but on conventional power, retaining those large numbers of troops? And what are the lessons that perhaps David Lammy might need to take on board with his relationship with Rachel Reeves?
Okay, thank you. And we had a third question, the lady there in the third row. And anyone else wants to raise your hands in the back row? I'll get John to answer these 3 and then I'll take some more.
I'm just back from a month in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh on a Foreign Office project. And what I'd like to ask you is, if you look at now and the UK now, how do we tell ourselves a story that both has a foreign dimension but also deals with the very complicated, very leaky relationship of foreign politics into our politics? And thank you very much for talking about Dalton. My very late husband wrote about Dalton, so I actually lived with Dalton, really, for about 5 years.
Yes, that's right. Dalton, yeah, of course. Do you want to go?
I think I'd rather have lived with Attlee and Bevin than Dalton. This is a personal choice. So let me take the first two questions. So it's on the rickety international order, placing one's faith in that versus the harnessing of productive power, and then let me take the gentleman's question on as to where you find the money for that. Like I think if I knew the answer to that question, then I wouldn't be sitting here.
Where would you be sitting?
I could be Prime Minister. Who knew? So it's a real challenge, but there's ways of answering it, right? And one is yes. So actually, it turns out that a lot of grey metal armament ships, those things we thought were passé and previously passed and ran down our ability to produce, do turn out to be quite important, right? So there's an element of that of grey metal still being important. But secondly, there are areas where the new economy and the new political economy are being built up. I mentioned technology, artificial intelligence, life sciences, and services. Perhaps one of those as well, where the UK has strengths as well. So what do you do in those areas? Do you invest? There's massive questions that came across our desk quite a lot in government as to our role in the semiconductor supply chain, right? So the Netherlands has managed to carve out a bespoke role in the semiconductor supply chain, right? There's an over-enlarged role for Taiwan in the global semiconductor supply chain, but that's a consideration as well. So you've got to make bets in some of these industries of the future. Then how do you navigate? It might be a question for John Healy as much as David Lammy. How do you navigate? So the first answer is that Attlee and Bevin took it away from the Treasury and had a secret meeting in which Dalton couldn't attend, right? I mean, actually, you can't do that in number 10. You can. It's so, you know, that's subcommittees and of cabinet are a useful device. There's one. But I mean, this is a hugely vexed and difficult period because Britain is decreasing its defence spending. It also has a manpower problem in domestic industries, which it needs to fire up, and therefore it needs to demobilise in a lot of these areas. So there's a push and pull that whole time, and rearmament brings down the Labour government. Essentially, it causes these massive splits between whether you extend the NHS principle to prescriptions in glasses and dentistry, versus rearm to defend Korea. Over this period of time, so it causes an active split in the government. So these things are extremely difficult, and the arguments are not won. They're fought over when Attlee is having his teeth fixed, ironically, and he's being visited successfully by his Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Defence Minister as well. The Chiefs of Staff threatened to resign collectively in 1947. So like, there's nothing. I don't want to take any easy lessons from that period of time because it's immensely difficult. Sorry.
A few more questions.
Oh yeah, excellent.
There's that second question, and then the lady, and then I'll take a few more before we wrap up. Did you take?
Yes, I took those questions.
Yeah, and
then Jean, I think you're getting at so actually the diaspora politics a little bit as well. Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question. It's not that different in some respects. There's diaspora politics in Attlee's East End, as you well know, right? And there's diaspora politics in a lot of the Labour Party political positioning as well, which is worth, but it's not on a scale because of I just don't know the answer. It's a great question.
Okay, I'm going to take more questions. I'm going to go towards the back this time as I privilege the front. Your hand is very raised, so you just look behind you. You first, and then you at the back in the white shirt, and then you on the far left, my left. So you go first, please.
Hello, John. So can I ask something quite specific? If you look at the Treaty of Washington, and you cast a Trumpite eye over it, two things leap out. First of all, it commits the signatories to upholding the United Nations Charter. And secondly, Article 3 specifically commits the signatories to developing their defence capacity, developing being the key word there, and to self-help, to protect themselves against attack. What do you think Bevin would sort of be saying now to Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, etc., about applying those?
Show some backbone, I guess he'd be saying. Gentleman on the right there. Sorry, and then there's two more questions to take. Then we've got 5 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up. Ben Judah, you missed progressive realism. You go first.
Queen Mary, University of London. We have a Prime Minister who's a human rights lawyer and has, I think, if you were to talk about his foreign policy vision, it seems to be that we'll be the envy of the world in following the rules better than anyone else, and that will earn us the world's respect. I wondered what you thought, what Bevin's view was on, particularly on international courts and following the rules of international courts. I think this in the context of the ECHR and how there was a lot of suspicion in the Attlee government about the ECHR, including Lord Jowett, his Lord Chancellor, saying that he recoiled in horror at the proposal of European Court of Human Rights.
Okay, well, one more, then Maurice Glassman also wants to ask questions, so we're going to wrap up with Maurice's question. One more down there at the back, please.
Hi, I take your point about that you shouldn't underestimate the fragility of Britain's position in 1945, but like evidently we're a far less internationally consequential nation today. So I suppose my question is, what cards do we still have left to play in shaping the international order in the 21st century?
That's a good question. And then Maurice, do you want a quick question for you? There's a gentleman coming in the microphone.
Only that I think I can answer the question on human rights. Yeah, I mean, his contempt, he was a completely bilateral in that way. I just want to say, John, thanks. That's really it. But also, to stress how ferociously anti-communist Bevin was. I mean, in terms of the Transport and General Workers' Union, in terms of absolutely opposing the Popular Front. You could be, I might find this fate upon me, but you could be expelled from the Labour Party for supporting the Popular Front, as was Stafford Cripps, who then became the Chancellor, and Bevin's relationship with him was of absolute subordination to Bevin. So the double thing, the third thing is how his foreign policy aligned absolutely with free and democratic trade unions, above all in the Federal Republic of Germany, the establishment of co-determination. Okay, so what I'm saying is that for the future of the left, Blue Labour is kind of the cult of the personality. Bevin is the absolute lodestar, and particularly in relationship to the US, the way he got it through was saying that if we don't have, you remember 48 conference, we want a bomb, we want a bloody big bomb, and we want the Union Jack on
John's
it.
been through all that, Maurice.
Yeah, but that thing was precisely to have British autonomy.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
The question on the Treaty of Washington, the various clauses in it, it's a brilliant observation. And in fact, if you look at each of these documents, I mentioned the contest over the different terms in the Atlantic Charter and otherwise, they are designed, as I say, they are ballast, they're not just words, right? And they require collective responsibility. It requires those commitments on shared defence spending, burden share. They're all in there in text. So I think you simply go back and look at the text. These are actually remarkably good documents every time I've gone back to them. Secondly, I think I want to just pause a second and disabuse a notion that is not my intention of my lecture. Bevin, Attlee, each of these figures on the left of the party, I drew a distinction between a more conscience-based pacifist posture and this other side. They are all massive believers in international law and international order. Their lived experience is the collapse of that. My point is that those laws cannot be detached from reality, hard power, social conditions, all these things. They cannot be remote and over there. And the abstract quality of them doesn't ensure their delivery. So that, I mean, these people are all believers in that order, and it's harder, tougher terms as well as the principles. Okay, so I think that's really important to sort of establish. And then the kind of what cards thing, and we have plenty of cards. I think it is fair to say Britain is diminished versus being one of the big three out in 1945. Its problems, though, are less, actually, and less potentially catastrophic at that moment in time. But I was proud enough to be involved in government foreign policy on a range of issues. You take the back end of the Biden administration, the relationship the UK government had, and you look around the world and you say, let's take Ukraine policy, or let's take the kinetic response to Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, or let's take the fact that the UK twice, once under Conservative government, once under the Labour government, actually involved itself militarily in defence of Israel from an Iranian attack. Those are all pretty consequential things in a period of international order. Well, and I'd add something else about it. So we talk about this era of great power competition. We're also in a period, partly because the established relationships are quite fluid, in which middle powers, and in some cases small powers, who have special attributes, skills, whether it be intelligence, special forces, and artificial intelligence, sovereign wealth funds in other countries or geographic locations, are actually remarkably consequential. The question is how you turn that sort of macht into craft as well, and how you adapt it to those positions. So I say I'm not a pessimist or a pessimist when it comes to UK's position in the world. I don't want it to be overstated, but I think Ukraine provides a tangible example of where you can lead, galvanise, take risk, shape a situation rather than having been shaped upon you.
You're very patient. One more, last question. You third row. Yes, please. Just last question, you there, madam. Thank you. And that's it.
John, I'm so sorry to do this to you. G'day. Just that no one's asked it. What do you make of the Chagos deal?
Good question.
Thanks so much.
He's not a politician.
Thanks so much. Not a politician. I have some familiarity with it, but I'm definitely not going to get into it.
Okay, I'll get your private view and write about it. Okay, thank you so much, Professor John Bew.